Welcome to our channel. I know you come here searching for a story to fall asleep to, but remember, the darkness rarely allows peaceful sleep. First, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below telling me the time and place where you're listening from. Now let go. Turn off the lights. Pull the blanket close and let me take you into a spine-chilling journey where a single knock on the door at 3 a.m. might change everything. They say nothing good ever comes after midnight. The world grows quieter, the shadows stretch longer, and in the silence between ticking clocks and humming refrigerators, something else stirs. It is the time when the living retreat into sleep, and the veil between this world and the next feels thin, fragile, vulnerable. 3 a.m, the witching hour, some whisper, is when you are least safe, when the dark has its own rules, and when the most innocent sound can turn into a threat. A creak on the stair, a flutter against the window, or, worst of all, a knock on your door. That's where this story begins, though perhaps it would be more accurate to say that's where it ended for the person who told it. Never answer the knock at 3 a.m., they warned me, their voice trembling as if even the memory of it burned their tongue. It wasn't the kind of warning that sounded like superstition or a campfire tale. It had weight, like the sagging floorboards of an old house that has seen too much. And yet, against every instinct, against the primal urge to barricade the door and hide under the covers, I listened. I opened it. And what I saw, what I felt, is something I should never have let in. The knock was soft at first, almost polite, as though whoever or whatever stood outside didn't want to intrude. But in that hour, when the mind balances between dreams and reality, even the faintest sound is magnified. It echoed down the hallway, reverberating in the ribs, stirring something in the chest. I remember thinking it must be a mistake, some drunk neighbor, some lost traveler, anything rational. But deep down, before my feet even touched the floor, before I even reached for the handle, a part of me already knew this was no ordinary visitor. There's something uniquely terrifying about doors at night. By day, they are nothing more than slabs of wood, painted and varnished, familiar thresholds that keep the world in its place. But at night, a door is a barrier between safety and the unknown. It becomes thinner, weaker, as if the dark on the other side could bleed through the cracks. You can convince yourself you're secure, you're protected, but the truth is crueler. A door only keeps out what abides by rules, and the rules at 3 a.m. are not ours. I think that's why the warning felt so heavy. People don't tell stories about doors opening at noon or knocks that come during breakfast. These tales, the kind whispered in small towns, the kind parents tell their children not as bedtime stories but as desperate safeguards, always happen in the hours when the world is defenseless. Perhaps it is superstition, or perhaps it is memory, the collective recollection of centuries of people who opened that door and never returned the same. It is important to understand this isn't a ghost story in the way you might expect. Ghosts, after all, are at least human once. They have motives, unfinished business, fragments of memory clinging to the places they haunt. What stood at my door that night was not human, nor was it a lost soul searching for closure. It was something older,
colder, a presence that did not belong to any timeline I could recognize. The way the air shifted, the way the silence seemed to press against my skin, these were not the marks of the dead, but of something that feeds on the living.
When I think back to the first knock, I remember how it carried no urgency, no impatience. It was not the pounding of someone desperate for help. It was not the frantic banging of a victim fleeing danger. It was a ritual sound, deliberate, as though each tap of knuckle against wood was part of a pattern. 1 pause, 2 pause, 3. A rhythm that felt less like a request and more like an invitation. That's what made it so dangerous. It was patient. It knew time was on its side. The human mind does strange things at that hour. The shadows stretch across the floor in distorted shapes, and every groan of the house feels like it comes from something breathing. But there was nothing hallucinatory about the dread that filled me. Dread is instinct. It is the echo of every ancestor who learned the hard way what happens when you ignore warnings carved into the marrow of your being. My body shook, not because I was imagining something, but because some ancient part of me recognized exactly what stood on the other side of the door. Still, I opened it. And that choice is why I am telling you this now, in whispers, in shadows, as though speaking it too loud might bring it back. Because I want you to understand the weight of a warning ignored and the cost of curiosity when it collides with terror. They told me never to answer the knock at 3 a.m. They told me the rules, simple and clear. But rules are fragile when the silence is so thick you can hear your own heartbeat. When the sound of that knock claws into your head and refuses to leave. The worst mistakes are not born of defiance, they are born of wanting to know. And so here we are. I tell you this not because I think you will believe me. Most don't. Most will dismiss it as another urban legend, another whispered story designed to pass the time. But when the night deepens, when the clock slides past 3, when your house seems too quiet and your door feels too thin, you'll remember. You'll remember this voice, this story, and you'll pray when knocking never comes to you.
The night it happened was not remarkable at first. There were no storm clouds or flashes of lightning to warn you, no blood-red moon hanging low in the sky. It was an ordinary evening in late autumn, the kind of night when the air feels brittle and carries every sound a little farther than it should. I remember the smell of dry leaves outside, faint smoke curling from chimneys in the neighborhood, and the way the wind whispered through the trees like someone dragging their fingernails across a doorframe. I'd been up later than usual, restless. My phone lay abandoned on the nightstand. It screamed dark, while I sat at the edge of the bed with a cup of cold coffee untouched. The house itself was older than I'd like to admit, its wooden bones shifting and creaking in the night. But I had lived with those noises long enough to ignore them. What I couldn't ignore was the clock on the wall, ticking louder with every minute. 2:59. Then, inevitably, 3 o'clock. That was when the first knock came. It was soft, as I've said, but distinct enough to snap me from my daze. I froze, listening. Perhaps it was just the house settling, I told myself. Perhaps a branch had been carried by the wind against the siding. But no, there it was again, deliberate, measured. 3 knocks in perfect rhythm, followed by silence, so heavy it seemed to crush the air in my chest. I didn't move at first. I just sat there, listening, my pulse hammering in my ears. The warning, the one that I had heard years ago but never really believed, came back to me. It had been told to me by an older neighbor, a woman who lived 3 doors down. She had leaned over her fence one afternoon, her eyes sharp and hollow, and told me in a voice like cracked glass,
if you ever hear a knock on your door after 3 in the morning, don't answer. No matter how gentle, no matter how desperate, don't answer. At the time, I laughed it off. She was a woman shaped by old stories, I thought. Maybe she had grown up with folklore stitched into her upbringing, tales of spirits who wander at night, of entities who need invitation to cross a threshold. But as the knocking returned that night, steady and unrelenting, I realized her warning had not been given out of superstition. It had been given out of survival. The house seemed to grow colder with each knock. I pulled my blanket tighter, but the chill didn't come from the air. It came from inside, a coldness that seemed to seep through the walls, pooling in my chest like ice water. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, the door at the end glowing faintly in the weak moonlight spilling through the window. I wish I could say I resisted longer, that I had the strength to ignore it, but the sound wormed its way into me. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks again. Always the same rhythm, as if counting down to something unseen. My mind spun with possibilities. What if it was someone in trouble? What if someone was lost or hurt? What kind of person ignores a cry for help in the dead of night?
I rose, each step on the old floorboards groaning louder than the last, as though the house itself was protesting my choice. The hallway was suffocating in its stillness. My eyes strained against the dark, catching glimpses of shifting shadows that vanished as soon as I blinked. By the time I reached the door, the knocking had stopped. I stood there, trembling, staring at the brass handle, waiting. Silence pressed against me, and in that silence, I realized something unsettling. I hadn't heard footsteps. Whoever knocked hadn't moved away. They were still there, standing motionless on the other side. I pressed my ear against the door. Nothing. No breathing, no shuffling, just silence thick enough to smother me. Then, from the other side, a voice whispered my name. I froze. It was soft, fragile, almost pleading, the way a lost child might call out. But no one should have known my name. I hadn't spoken to anyone that day, hadn't posted online, hadn't given anyone reason to come here at this hour. Still, there it was again, my name, spoken in the same exact tone, the same exact cadence, as though whoever was outside was repeating a rehearsed line. Fear and curiosity battled inside me. My mind screamed that something was wrong, that no stranger at 3 a.m. should know my name. But my hand reached out anyway, trembling, wrapping around the cold metal handle. And then, before I could stop myself, I turned it. The door creaked as it opened, and for the briefest moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The hallway behind me grew darker, the air heavier, and the silence deeper than anything I had ever known. And on the other side, there was no one. Only the empty porch, the sway of the trees and the wind, and shadows that felt too thick, too unnatural, stretching farther than they should. But the air, the air was wrong. It smelled of iron and damp earth, like something freshly unearthed, the kind of smell that makes you think of graves, of soil overturned not by nature, but by hands. And then the voice came again, not from the porch, but from the dark beyond the trees. My name, whispered low, carried on a wind that seemed to shiver straight through my bones.
The night air hung heavy, pressing against my skin like a damp cloth. I stood frozen in the doorway, the world outside too still, too wrong. The street that usually carried the distant hum of cars was utterly silent, as though the neighborhood had been erased, leaving only my house, my door, and the dark. My name came again, not shouted, not spoken, but breathed, like the exhale of someone standing inches from my ear, though no one was there. The urge to slam the door shut surged through me, but something stronger held me in place. It wasn't bravery. It was the cruel curiosity that has undone countless people before me. I stepped 1 foot onto the porch. The wooden planks groaned under my weight, a noise far too loud in the suffocating quiet. The air smelled thicker out there, metallic and damp, as if rain had fallen, though the ground was dry. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another shadow cast by the trees, shifting in the dim moonlight. But shadows don't move against the wind. This one swayed, then straightened, then tilted its head, watching me. I couldn't make out features, only a tall, thin silhouette, darker than the night itself, standing between the trees. Its presence wasn't simply visual, it was felt, heavy and unnatural, as though the space around it bent inward, pulling me toward it. "Come closer," the voice whispered. Except now it wasn't just in the air, it was inside me, vibrating against my rib cage, slithering through the cracks of my mind. The voice was not a child's, not even human. It was layered. 1,000 faint whispers stacked together, all pronouncing my name in unison. I staggered back, finally slamming the door shut, my chest heaving. The lock clicked into place, but the thin piece of metal felt as effective as a thread against a storm. I pressed my back against the door, hoping, praying that the barrier still meant something. But the knocking returned. It wasn't soft anymore. It was slow, deliberate, each pound rattling through the wood, shaking the frame, as if testing it, measuring it. The rhythm had changed. It was no longer 3 knocks and silence. It was 4. 4 heavy strikes, each louder than the last. Then silence, then again. A pattern, unnatural, ritualistic. My phone lit up suddenly from the nightstand across the room, its glow sharp and blue. With shaking hands, I grabbed it. No calls, no messages, just one notification: front door camera, motion detected. But I didn't have a front door camera. The screen flickered, then showed a grainy video feed, as though some hidden eye had been watching me. The frame was angled from above my porch, facing directly at me as I stood clutching the phone. But it wasn't me the camera had focused on. Behind me, clear as daylight, a shadow stood inside the hallway. Its head was tilted, its arms hanging too long, fingers grazing the floor. I spun, the phone slipping from my hands, crashing against the hardwood. The hallway behind me was empty, yet the air rippled, faintly, as though something had just stepped aside, leaving the space it occupied unnervingly warm. The knocking stopped. The silence after it was worse than the sound itself. Silence meant movement. Silence meant it was no longer at the door. The floorboards above me groaned, slowly, one step, then another. The sound of someone or something walking carefully across the upstairs landing. My body locked with terror, every muscle screaming to run. But where? The front door was no longer safe. The shadows upstairs weren't mine anymore. I remembered the warning again, the one the old neighbor had given me. Never answer the knock. It wasn't superstition, it was instruction, and I had failed it. I grabbed the phone, my fingers numb, trying to dial anyone, anything. But the screen was wrong, static, crawling across it. The numbers weren't numbers anymore. They shifted, bent, rearranged into symbols I couldn't recognize. And then the whisper returned, not from outside, not from upstairs, but from the speaker of my phone. My name, said with 1,000 mouths. The temperature dropped sharply.
my breath fogging in the air. The house itself seemed to shrink around me, the walls breathing, the floor trembling faintly like the heartbeat of something alive. I stumbled back toward the living room, knocking over a lamp, the crash swallowed almost instantly by the thickening silence. That was when the mirror caught my eye. It was an old mirror, hanging crooked on the far wall, something I had stopped noticing years ago. But now its surface rippled like water. In it, I saw not myself, but the open front door, the shadow waiting, its head tilting in the same steady rhythm as the knocking had been. Except I hadn't opened the door again. I was standing far from it, yet the reflection showed a different truth. The shadow lifted its arm in the mirror, fingers extending toward me, not toward the version of me in the reflection, but toward me, directly, as if it knew I was watching. Slowly, impossibly, the glass began to crack, spiderwebbing outward from the place where its hand pressed. I turned away, too afraid to look any longer, my pulse ragged, my throat raw. And in that moment, I realized something worse than the shadow outside, worse than the presence upstairs. The knocking wasn't an attempt to enter, it was a distraction. Something else had already been let inside.
When people hear a story like this, their first instinct is to file it away under fiction, to breathe a sigh of relief and dismiss it as nothing more than an overactive imagination. It's safer that way. Easier to tuck the fear into the same drawer as urban legends, ghost stories, and the half-remembered warnings your grandmother whispered when you were small. But to do that is to miss the darker truth. This story doesn't live in isolation. It connects to a lineage of human fear, to real events that stain the pages of history and the quiet corners of local lore. Think of the black-eyed children's stories. They've circulated for decades, some say centuries. Reports of children knocking on doors in the middle of the night, asking to be let inside, their voices polite but uncanny. People who claim to encounter them describe an overwhelming sense of dread, the way their bodies screamed to run, even as the children pleaded. The warnings were always the same: don't open the door, don't let them in. Yet some did, and those who did were never quite right afterward, haunted, sick, changed in ways they could never articulate. Or think of the countless cases of people who simply vanished after answering a knock they shouldn't have. Rural police logs carry stories of missing persons that begin with something mundane, last seen at home around 2 a.m. Neighbors sometimes recall hearing strange noises, a door creaking open when no visitor should have come, a figure standing by the porch light that didn't belong. These aren't the dramatic tales Hollywood gives us. They're quieter, unfinished tragedies that leave families with nothing but questions. There are parallels, too, in cultures across the world. In Japan, there's the legend of Akaname, the filth liquor, said to slip into houses during the night, called not by invitation, but by neglect. In parts of Eastern Europe, old tales warned of midnight visitors, spirits who could only cross a threshold if someone answered their knock. And here, closer to home, in the rural South, elders used to speak of death knocking, a hollow rap on the door heard just before someone in the household passed away. Different countries, different eras, but the thread is the same. The knock at night is never just a knock. What makes these stories endure isn't only their supernatural suggestion, but their psychological weight. At its core, answering the door at 3 a.m. is about vulnerability. You are barefoot, half asleep, and unguarded. You are a creature meant to be at rest. When a knock comes, then it tears you out of safety and demands a choice. The dread that coils in your chest
isn't only about what might be on the other side. It's about the violation of your most private boundary. Your home, your door, the one place that should protect you, suddenly becomes the target. And fear of thresholds runs deep. Anthropologists note that nearly every culture has rituals for doorways, windows, gates, symbols of passage between one realm and another. Doors are not just wood and hinges. They are lines we cross or lines we hold. And when something on the other side demands entry, it is not merely asking to come into your house, it is asking to come into your life. The case of the 3 a.m. knock becomes even more unsettling when viewed against real-world patterns of crime. Consider how often predators, both human and otherwise, rely on trust and curiosity to disarm their victims. Criminals have knocked on doors in the middle of the night pretending to be in distress, knowing that human instinct is to help. Serial offenders have used this tactic for decades, exploiting kindness as a weapon. How different is that, really, from the shadow outside? The face changes, the method shifts, but the danger is the same. The moment you open the door, you surrender control. Psychologists suggest that stories like these survive because they tap into primal survival strategies. Fear isn't irrational, it's protective. That instinct that screams not to open the door, not to look in the mirror, not to follow the whisper, is the echo of thousands of years of survival. Yet we fight it. We label it paranoia. We convince ourselves we're being silly. We choose curiosity over caution, even when every hair on our body stands on end. And sometimes that choice is the last one people make. Even now, if you search late-night forums or listen closely to whispered accounts, you'll hear new variations. A man in Ohio who swore his doorbell rang at 3:13 a.m. every night for a week, though the camera showed no one there. A woman in England who claimed she heard her dead mother's voice calling her name from outside the door at precisely 3 a.m. A family in rural Texas who packed up and fled their home after months of phantom knocking that escalated into furniture moving on its own. These aren't the dramatic ghost stories Hollywood gives us. They're quieter, unfinished tragedies that leave families with nothing but questions. The weight of these stories lies not in their proof, but in their persistence. Why do we keep telling them? Why do warnings like "never answer the knock at 3 a.m. echo across cultures and generations? Maybe because beneath the supernatural dressing, they carry a truth we can't deny. Danger often comes politely. It waits, it knocks, and it asks us to open the door ourselves.
If you followed me this far, you already know this is not the kind of story that offers neat answers or clean escapes. It is not about silver bullets or salt lines, not about priests with holy water or ghost hunters with gadgets. It is about a moment, a single choice, and the irreversible consequences that spiral from it. I opened the door. I let the knock inside, and nothing in my life was ever the same afterward. The days that followed bled together into something I can only describe as wrong. I'd wake at odd hours, always between 2:57 and 3:07 a.m., as if my body were tethered to that hour now, forever bound to it. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, elongating in corners, bending against the light. Sometimes I'd hear my name whispered from another room, though no one was there. Sometimes I'd see the faint imprint of hands on the glass, pressed from the inside when I hadn't touched them. But the worst part wasn't what I saw or heard, it was what I felt. The certainty that I was never alone, that something had followed me, not from outside into the house, but from that moment of invitation into my very life, into my reflection, into my silence. I think often of that neighbor who warned me, the one whose hollow eyes carried more truth than I wanted to admit. She knew. She must have known. Perhaps she too had heard it once and resisted. Perhaps she had watched someone else fail. When she told me never answer the knock at 3 a.m., it wasn't superstition. It was an attempt to save me. And I ignored it. The human mind is fragile when it comes to the dark. We like to believe that our locks and our lights keep us safe. We like to believe that we control who enters and who doesn't. But there are things that don't need to force their way in. They just wait. They knock. And when we open the door, we do the rest for them. Maybe you've laughed at this, telling yourself it's just a story, just a fabrication designed to chill the blood. I hope so. I hope for your sake that's all it is. But I've seen the patterns. I've read the accounts. I've felt the air shift when the clock slides past 3. It happens more often than people admit, more often than makes sense. Some houses are never lived in for long. Some neighborhoods have one house everyone avoids. Some missing person reports start with nothing more than the sound of a knock. So let me leave you with this final warning, because I may not have much longer before the silence in this room deepens again. If you ever hear it, the soft, deliberate knock at 3 a.m., do not get up. Do not check the window. Do not touch the handle. Don't let curiosity or pity or pride guide your hand. Stay in bed. Stay still. Let the knocking fade away unanswered. Because once you open the door, it doesn't matter whether you see someone standing there or not. The act of opening is enough. The invitation is made. And remember this: what waits on the other side of that door doesn't need your permission to enter again. It just needs the memory of the night you let it in. So if you hear it, if the silence of your house is broken by that unnatural rhythm, if your skin prickles and the clock glares at you with those 3 cursed digits, know this: you're already not alone. The next sound you hear might be the knock. And the question is not whether you'll answer it. The question is whether you'll survive ignoring it.